Chapter 23. Rachel wore the same drab gel-issued uniform that clung to her skin, as though it had absorbed every ounce of despair from the women who had worn it before her. It made her feel incarcerated. "You'll be taken to court tomorrow," Emmanuel informed her. "You'll enter a plea of not guilty, and I will arrange for your bail. Do you have the funds to post it?" She shook her head. "Any family who can help you?" Another shake. No words. He exhaled quietly. "Then I'll loan you the money." At that, she turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "I don't want it," she said flatly. "I don't mind being here." "No," he countered, his voice firm but patient. "You don't belong here. You didn't set out to kill him. It was a mistake." Her jaw tensed. "Stop punishing yourself," he continued. "You need to stay focused. More importantly, you need to stay positive. Your life doesn't have to end in a cell. Edward understood that, and that is why he brought me in." She clenched her fists and shook her head. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I do understand," he pressed. "More than you think. And I need you to start thinking beyond yourself. Don't make this just about you. Fight for your baby. Let your voice be heard. Tell your side of the story." He bent and reached for his briefcase, pulled out a single document and passed it to Rachel across the table. "I cannot move forward without you giving your consent for me to. I met with Lisa." "Lisa?" he questioned. "Yes, Lisa King." "And what did she have to say?" Rachel took the pen he had left on the sheet of paper and, without reading its contents, signed on the dotted line and passed it back to him. He looked at it and smiled. "To trust you instead of my pain," Rachel responded. The next day, the courtroom was packed with people and anticipation. Reporters jostled for position. Their cameras flashed like strobes as Rachel was led in, wrists enshackled. Her steps faltered under the weight of their accusations. Her face was pale, but she kept her head high, forcing herself to walk with purpose. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Emmanuel was already there. He exuded calm despite the chaos. He wore a tailored charcoal suit. His posture was relaxed, almost nonchalant, but his eyes were sharp. They scanned the room and missed nothing. When their eyes met, he gave her a slight nod, a silent promise. "I've got you." She tried to believe him. He was all she had at this point. There was no Edward to lean on. The bailiff guided her to her seat, his expression solemn, the wordless accusation evident. Her bump was visible as she made her way forward. She could no longer hide it. It was as though the baby demanded acknowledgement in the proceedings against its mother for the death of its father. Catherine's gaze snapped to the swell beneath Rachel's gown, and a tremor of fury flickered across her expression before she masked it behind her polished composure. Colour drained from her wrinkled face, and even from across the courtroom, the heat of her glare was unmistakable. The energy in the courthouse seemed to rise. Charlotte did not glare. She wilted as she stared at the bump, a tiny life that was part of Edward. Her lips parted, then closed again. She folded her hands in her lap, staring at them, as though the sight might shatter her completely if she kept looking. Every reaction was noted by the press. Everyone rose at the instruction of the bailiff for Judge Olam. He was the judge presiding over the case of the Crown versus Rachael Brown. He stuck to the letter of the law and was known for his unwavering adherence to due process. His stride was purposeful. His silver hair, neatly combed back, and precisely trimmed beard lent him the appearance of a man who had long mastered the balance of power and restraint. His eyes, softened at the edges, still carried an authority that silenced the room without a word. He took his seat. Minutes later, Rachel was asked, "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Her voice wavered as she held her bump and replied, I do. Thank you, Miss Brown. The judge's gavel struck. The sharp crack echoed, demanding silence. His voice boomed across the room, each word deliberate. In the case of the Crown versus Rachael Brown, how do you plead? Rachel's throat went dry. She looked at Emmanuel. His gaze bored into hers, urging her to hold her ground. She drew a breath and forced her voice steady. Not guilty, Your Honor. A murmur rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. Disbelief, outrage, curiosity, faces blurred together, each expression dripping with judgment. Rachael felt the weight of their scrutiny. Order, the bailiff shouted. The judge turned to the stenographer. Please note the defendant's plea. The room fell into tense silence. Gerald Thornton rose from his seat, icy green eyes fixed on Rachael. Your Honor, he began, his voice smooth and confident. Bail is opposed under the Bail Act. He let the words hang. There are substantial grounds to believe that if granted bail, the defendant will fail to surrender to custody and is highly likely to abscond, given her strong ties outside the UK. This assessment is based on the severity of the alleged offence and the overwhelming strength of the evidence against her. He let the implication linger. Gerald's voice grew colder. On the 25th of May, the defendant used a 4-inch knife on the victim, Mr. Edward Hale, a respected member of society. Rachael felt the words hit her like a blow. Her vision blurred. The room swayed around her. It wasn't like that. It wasn't intentional. Emmanuel placed his hands on hers as though to communicate some measure of calm through the worst parts of the hearing. Gerald's voice remained impassive as he narrated the cold, brutal facts. This callous act led to his death, leaving behind an elderly mother who depended on him and a sister who was extremely close to him since childhood. If released, the defendant is a flight risk and poses a danger to the public. After all, who's to say she won't react violently if provoked again? He paused for effect, letting his words fester. It is also worth noting that the defendant confessed to committing this act in the statement she made to the police. Considering this admission, the Crown contends that the case is effectively decided. He turned to the judge, his expression confident and triumphant. For these reasons, Your Honor, the Crown invites you to deny bail on the grounds that the defendant poses a significant risk of absconding or reoffending. He returned to his seat, posture relaxed, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Game over, his face seemed to say. Emmanuel remained still, his face expressionless, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Rachel's heart pounded, her pulse roared in her ears. She glanced at Emmanuel, panic rising in her throat. He deliberately shook his head at her. It was a slight, intentional movement. Not yet. Not over yet, he seemed to say. Rachael swallowed and forced herself to breathe, to focus. Emmanuel stood, his shoulders squared, his voice clear and steady. Your Honor, if I may. The judge nodded for him to speak. Your Honor, he began, I submit that my client, Rachael Brown, has endured an extraordinary amount of trauma. I must remind the court that the defendant has just lost her husband. She is pregnant, vulnerable, and still in a state of profound shock, and needs to be in a familiar environment to begin the healing process. A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom, a ripple of shock mixed with intrigue, triggered by the word husband. At the defendant's table, Rachael sat still, her hands gripping the edge of her chair so tightly her knuckles looked as though they might crack. She stared at the polished surface before her. Her thoughts spiraled. They'll never understand. The prosecutor, the jury, every single person in this room belonged to the same untouchable camp, a world that would condemn her without hesitation. She swallowed hard as the pulse in her neck throbbed against her skin. Emmanuel's voice broke through her thoughts. Your Honor, I would respectfully submit that the defendant is not the kind of person who would flee the country. She has no intention of running. She is fully prepared to comply with any conditions the court deems necessary for her bail. He exhaled slightly and allowed his words to settle before continuing. If the court harbors concerns, I would suggest imposing stringent conditions upon my client. She has a stable address within the jurisdiction, and a residency condition could be enforced. A curfew and daily check-ins at the local police station. These measures would ensure she remains under strict supervision. Emmanuel pressed on, his argument reaching its peak. My client maintains her plea, has no prior convictions, and I must stress that the Crown's case is not as unshakable as it appears. There are reasonable doubts, significant ones. I firmly believe that imposing stringent bail conditions would sufficiently address the concerns of the court, ensuring that justice is not compromised while allowing my client the dignity of awaiting trial outside a cell. He turned slightly towards the judge. Unless I can assist Your Honor further, those are my submissions. Judge Olam removed his glasses and set them down before him. He leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and swept his gaze across the courtroom. He was a judge who spoke only when necessary, and when he did, it was in everyone's interest to listen. The silence stretched before he spoke. I have carefully considered the arguments presented before me. He turned his piercing gaze to the defense table. It is indeed true that the defendant has no prior history of criminal activity. She has remained largely unknown to law enforcement in any criminal capacity. A flicker crossed Rachel's face. Not relief, not yet, but something close to it. She held her breath, hopeful, wishful. However, we cannot ignore the gravity of the charge before us. Mr. Edward Hale was a respected member of society, and his life was ended in an act of brutal violence. Given the severity of this case, I have no choice but to deny bail. Her mind went blank. The words hit like a hammer, crushing, final. She sat rigid, her breath shallow, her thoughts racing. She had hoped for a different outcome, a merciful decision. Hearing the judge's words stung in a way she had not anticipated. The weight of the decision bore down on her as she sat, defeated, in the dock. She fought to keep her composure, but the tears, long held at bay, began to fall in quiet rivulets down her cheeks. Rachel barely heard the murmur that followed, barely registered the shifting of bodies or the scribbling of pens as reporters hurriedly noted the decision. The gavel struck once. Bailiff, the judge commanded, remand the defendant into custody. The courtroom dissolved into motion. The stenographer's fingers flew across the keyboard as she recorded every moment, every word, every breath. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The floor seemed to tilt. The walls closed in. No, no, no. The bailiff approached and placed the cold cuffs back onto her tired wrists as Rachel forced herself to breathe. She had let herself hope that it would not come to this. She had known deep down that it could, but she had hoped anyway, for her baby, and that made it harder to bear. Outside the courtroom, flashbulbs burst as photographers captured the beginning of her downfall. The perfect image. A broken woman in chains, tears glistening in artificial light. A single click of a shutter and it would be on tomorrow's front page. Online, Lola & Company would push a narrative. A killer's tears in court. Rachel felt the scrutiny. The accusations disguised as curiosity, the righteous satisfaction in the eyes of those who had already decided her fate. She closed her eyes. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Romans 10:9.